In just 6 hours, 7 billionaire CEOs were dragged from luxury hotel suites and thrown into prison cells by one man, Ibrahim Traoré, a young African leader who dared to do what no one had done in 50 years. He stood up, he fought back, and he won. Entire villages poisoned, children forced into dark tunnels to mine gold they'd never touch, fathers buried under rubble, mothers paid in silence, $500 billion in wealth stolen from one of the poorest countries on earth. But on March 15th at 6 a.m. sharp, everything changed. This wasn't just a political move. It was personal. It was righteous. It was a reckoning long overdue. And while this story is inspired by truth, some names, events, and dialogues have been dramatized for emotional impact. Because even if the events are imagined, the pain is real, the injustice is real, and the dream of a free, dignified Africa, that is more real than ever. What happens when a Black African leader fights back, and the empire that once ruled trembles? You're about to find out. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Darkness still wrapped itself tightly around the city of Ouagadougou. The streets were silent, save for the occasional hiss of wind through rusted fences and the distant bark of a street dog. But beneath that silence, something stirred. At 5:58 a.m., a convoy of black, unmarked armored trucks turned slowly onto a narrow side road near the city center. The engines didn't roar. They hummed, low and precise. Inside, elite special forces in full tactical gear sat in silence, eyes locked, fingers curled around triggers. The only light came from the faint green glow of night vision goggles. 2 minutes, came a whisper through the comms. All units in position. From above, a drone camera feed flickered across multiple screens in a control room buried beneath the National Defense Headquarters. In the center stood Ibrahim Traoré, calm, composed, his hands clasped behind his back. His eyes didn't blink. He had waited months for this moment, years perhaps. Behind him, a digital countdown struck 000134. 5:59 a.m. The hotels across the capital, 7 luxury hotels shimmered under soft lamplight. Marble floors, glass elevators, golden chandeliers. The kind of places where foreign executives slept soundly in robes embroidered with their initials. On the 15th floor of the Grand Montel Hotel, Viktor Petrov, CEO of Goldmax Corporation, stirred in bed. His private security team had already done their rounds. Cameras, guards, reinforced doors. He was untouchable, or so he believed. Suddenly, a power outage. Total blackout. Emergency lights failed to activate. His phone? No signal. Then a loud metallic snap. The door. It cracked open like dry bone. "Get on the ground, now!" 3 soldiers swarmed in, masked and armed. Petrov froze, half-dressed, disoriented, completely exposed. He was dragged from his bed, still clutching his passport, into the hallway. Across town in the Sky Haven Hotel, Jean-Claude Dubois, the smug, cigar-smoking CEO of Western Gold Mining, was stepping into his private elevator. His flight was waiting at the airport. He smirked as he checked his Rolex. He never made it to the ground floor. The elevator doors opened, and instead of the hotel lobby, 6 masked men in black uniforms stared back. Dubois turned pale. His phone clattered to the floor as he was shoved against the wall. 5:59 a.m., the airport, at Ouagadougou International Airport. A Gulfstream G700 jet sat glowing on the tarmac, flight plan filed, engines on standby. In the tower, a junior air traffic controller blinked in confusion. Every single runway signal had just gone dark. Even the radio lines went dead. "Sir, we've lost the tower. Something's wrong." In a nearby hangar, Australian exec Michael Thompson was on a secure call, frantically moving digital funds from one offshore account to another. His laptop screen showed, "Transfer $42 million, pending confirmation." That confirmation never came. Instead, the metal door behind him burst open, and he spun around just in time to see 2 rifles pointed straight at his chest. "Don't move. Step away from the laptop." He hesitated. They fired a warning shot straight into the floor by his feet. He moved, 5:59 a.m. The control room inside the nerve center. Traoré didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply nodded as each arrest report came in. Petrov, secure. Dubois, secure. Thompson, secure. The screen lit up with satellite visuals. 7 glowing red dots turned green. Target neutralized. One of the officers beside him leaned in, whispering, "All 7. No resistance." We caught them off guard. Traoré exhaled, just once. Not out of relief, but out of controlled satisfaction. He wasn't celebrating. He was just beginning. 6 a.m., the city wakes. In the dusty suburbs of the capital, an old radio crackled to life. We interrupt regular programming for a breaking announcement. A shopkeeper tilted his head. A miner's wife paused while cooking. A child stopped pedaling her bike. The air felt heavy, charged. And then across TV screens, news feeds, and street projectors, one stark sentence appeared in bold red: March 15th, Africa awakens. The convoy cut through Ouagadougou's back streets just as dawn smeared an iron-gray streak across the horizon. No sirens, no horns, only the crunch of gravel beneath armored tires. When the trucks reached the edge of the city, they turned onto a narrow dirt road flanked by tall acacia and half-collapsed warehouses. At the end of that road stood Block 26, a low, sand-colored compound once built by the French Foreign Legion. Long abandoned, now reborn for a single purpose: to hold 7 men who had believed they were untouchable. Inside, the cells were nothing more than concrete rectangles, 12 feet by 8, lit by a single bare bulb that buzzed like an angry wasp. No silk sheets, no private minibars, no climate control, just a thin cot bolted to the floor, a steel toilet without a seat, and a barred window that stared onto a yard of red dust. The air smelled of bleach and distant smoke, laced with the faint, metallic tang of iron doors that hadn't been used in years. The first to arrive was Victor Petrov. Still wearing hotel slippers and a monogram robe, he stumbled out of the truck, wrists cuffed, blinking as if the world had betrayed him. When the guard yanked him forward, his robe dragged through the dust, leaving a pale, snake-like trail. Next came Jean-Claude Dubois, the smirk gone, cigar ashes still clinging to his collar. He tried to protest in rapid-fire French: human rights, diplomatic immunity, stock prices. But the soldiers answered with silence and a shove between the shoulder blades. Michael Thompson, gaunt and jittery, clutched an imaginary cell phone, thumbs twitching at phantom screens. 4 more followed. Mackenzie, Harrison, Williams, Anderson, all forced into a single-file march through a rusted gate that slammed shut behind them like a judge's gavel. Block 26's interior corridor stretched 30 yards, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes. To the left, 7 fresh-painted doors, each bearing a number in chalk-white strokes. To the right, a chain-link partition divided the passage from an empty common room where a cracked radio whispered an old Fela Kuti song about colonial plunder. The irony cut deeper than the chill. Petrov was the first to smell it: disinfectant mixed with a sweet-sour odor of sweat and damp stone. He gagged. Dubois raised his wrists, demanding the cuffs be removed. A guard obliged, then locked them behind the cell door a second later. Thompson scanned the ceiling for cameras, found none, and for the first time realized the gravity of silence. No PR team, no emergency line, no satellite link, only his breath echoing against cinder block. 10 minutes later, a side door creaked open and Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the corridor. He wore no medals, no ostentatious epaulets, just a pressed olive uniform and dust-stained boots. Tall, lean, early 30s, his skin the deep bronze of Sahel sunsets. He moved with the quiet certainty of a man who had already walked this hallway 1,000 times in his mind. The soldiers straightened instinctively. Even the air seemed to snap to attention. Traoré paused at cell 3, Petrov's. Without a word, he slid a small ledger through the bars, a ledger thick with photocopied invoices and redlined entries showing missing tons of gold. Petrov stared, eyes wide, then looked up to meet a gaze so steady it felt like a searchlight. There was no anger in Traoré's expression, only an implacable, burning focus, as if he were a surgeon studying a malignant growth he was determined to remove. He continued to cell 4, where Dubois paced like a caged panther. Traoré removed a folded photograph from his pocket. A 12-year-old boy hunched underground, helmet too large, eyes ringed with coal dust. He pressed the photo against the bars. Dubois stopped pacing. The corridor fell into a hush so dense it swallowed the humming lights. In cell 5, Thompson sat on the floor, knees up, rocking. Traoré slid in a sealed evidence bag holding a USB drive, the digital rope Thompson had tried to throw overboard. A single label read cyanide dump plans. Thompson's rocking stopped. He reached for the bag with trembling hands, but Traoré had already moved on. At the corridor's far end, Traoré turned, hands clasped behind his back. His voice, when it came, was low yet carried to every corner of the wing. For decades you slept on Egyptian cotton while my people slept on gravel. You drank from crystal while children drank poison. Tonight you will taste their water, breathe their air, and count the minutes the way they counted the days. He did not shout. He didn't need to. Each syllable landed with the weight of an iron door. A guard unlocked a mesh panel, revealing 7 small slots, meal hatches no wider than a loaf of bread. Traoré inspected them, then nodded. The guard slid through bowls of rice and plain water, steam already cooling in the morning chill. No silverware, no napkins. Petrov muttered, "Is this even safe?" The guard closed the hatch without comment. Traoré walked back toward the exit, boots echoing in a deliberate, unhurried rhythm. As he reached the threshold, he paused and glanced over his shoulder. His eyes were dark, but not cold. They blazed with a purpose that felt older than the prison itself, older than the empire he intended to dismantle. Then he was gone, the heavy door booming shut behind him. The CEOs listened as his footsteps receded, swallowed by the labyrinth of corridors. For the first time, they were forced to confront a silence unbroken by wealth or power. A silence filled only by their own racing hearts and the distant chorus of a city that was beginning to wake to a brand new day. The man who had just walked past 7 prison cells without blinking, who stared down billionaires as if they were petty thieves, who commanded silence with nothing more than his breath. Who was he? Before the olive uniform, before the salute, before the world knew his name, Ibrahim Traoré was a boy from the dusty mining town of Yalgo in northern Burkina Faso, where the earth was dry, the sun unforgiving, and the gold beneath their feet never belonged to them. His father, Hamadou, worked the mines, not with machines or helmets, just a rusted pickaxe and a bent back. He came home each evening covered in soot and silence. The gold he pulled out was shipped in armored trucks bound for Europe, but at home they boiled cassava and stretched it thin. Ibrahim was only 10 when the collapse happened. It was the rainy season. Water had seeped into the tunnels. The foreign supervisors were warned repeatedly. They ignored the warnings. When the ground gave way, it swallowed 12 men. Only one body was ever recovered. It was Hamadou's. They found him clutching a broken flashlight, his arm still outstretched, as if reaching for a son he'd never hold again. At the funeral, Ibrahim didn't cry. He stood by the mound of red earth, fists clenched, eyes locked forward, silent as the village elders chanted. Someone asked if he wanted to say something. He shook his head. But that night, sitting outside his family's crumbling mud brick house, staring up at a sky full of stars that never answered, he whispered 5 words into the wind. "This doesn't end like this." Years passed. He studied hard, harder than anyone around him. He joined the military at 17, not out of duty, but out of hunger to understand the machine from the inside. He trained under French commanders, learned tactics, maps, logistics. But what stayed with him most wasn't the strategy. It was the looks. The way foreign officers treated local soldiers as replaceable. The jokes about primitive workforces. The way orders were barked, not spoken. One day he watched as villagers were dragged from their homes to clear a new mining road for a Canadian company. A mother screamed as her son was taken. "Just for the day," they said. That boy never returned. Ibrahim didn't speak, not yet, but the words inside him hardened like stone. His rise through the ranks was swift. Some said it was luck, others said it was fear. He had a way of making even his superiors uneasy. He didn't party, didn't bribe, didn't smile unless it was earned. At 28, he became the youngest intelligence officer in the National Guard. That same year, during an operation near the Taparco mine, he found something that shattered whatever restraint he had left. A mass grave, half covered with dirt and loose mining equipment. The bodies weren't armed rebels. They were miners, local men, women, and children. Silenced, disposed of, forgotten. That night back in camp, Ibrahim stood alone beside a cooking fire, eyes red from smoke and fury. A fellow officer asked, "Why do you still care, man? You can't fix this." Ibrahim looked up, jaw tight, voice low but steady. "If I ever lead this country," he said, "I will tear them down." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Those who heard him never forgot the moment, not because it was loud, but because it was final. Like a fuse had just been lit, and it had. Because years later, that same boy from the dust of Yalgo would walk the polished marble floors of presidential halls and drag the men who built empires on his people's backs into cells without windows. He never forgot where he came from. He never let the uniform become his shield. And now the world would remember his name, not because he asked them to, but because he left no choice. Gold is a strange kind of ghost in Burkina Faso. Everybody knows it's there, yet almost no one has ever touched it. Deep under the cracked savanna, seems the color of sunrise snake for miles. So rich that geologists call them bonanzas. Every dawn, thousands of men shuffle toward narrow pits with headlamps and homemade pulleys. By dusk, their sacks glitter with flecks of metal that could buy a house in Paris. And still, when night falls, paraffin lamps glow in clay huts, women boil thin porridge, and children fall asleep to the rumble of haul trucks they will never ride. On paper, the industry looks triumphant. 32 active sites, foreign investment in the billions, production charts that climb like rocket trails. Glossy brochures boast Burkina Faso, Africa's new El Dorado, showing aerial shots of terraced pits spiraling into the earth like inverted ziggurats. The government's old press releases repeat the same refrain: jobs, growth, progress. Yet step outside the conference halls and the truth tastes like dust. At the northern edge of the Tep Parco concession, a chain-link fence marks the dividing line between two universes. On one side, Villa Argentum, a walled compound where the Goldmax regional director spends his 6-month rotations. White stucco, emerald lawn, sprinklers clicking in perfect rhythm. A blue-tiled pool glints behind glass doors. A gardener prunes bougainvillea in 105-degree heat. Inside, Italian marble underfoot, central air whispering, a stocked wine cellar. The director likes to host poker nights, cigars, jazz, the clink of baccarat crystal, each hand worth more than a miner's annual wage. 10 meters away beyond the fence, a group of village boys kick a ragged ball through red powder. Their goalposts are stacks of broken cinder block. When the wind shifts, it carries the smell of chlorine and grilled sirloin from the villa, mingling with the scent of diesel and sweat from the pits. The boys laugh anyway. Laughter is free, and freedom is the only thing no one has bothered to fence off. From the air, the contrast is even starker. Mansions gleam like polished coins, while whole settlements sprawl in chaotic grids of corrugated tin. Satellite images show dirt paths etched into the earth, tracing the daily migration of laborers who descend at sunrise and emerge at twilight, with backs bowed and lungs blackened. Statistics bury the personal cost. Silicosis rates triple the national average, life expectancy in mining zones a decade shorter than the rest of the country. But statistics don't capture the way a father stares at his palms each evening, wondering why gold feels lighter than bread. Companies issue annual sustainability reports brimming with photos of smiling workers in new overalls. They speak of community uplift, carbon neutrality, responsible stewardship. Meanwhile, tanker trucks haul ore concentrate south to coastal ports, where it disappears into cargo holds bound for refineries in Switzerland, Dubai, Shanghai. At those refineries, the gold loses its memory. Bars stamped with fresh serial numbers enter global vaults. Spotless, unburdened by the stories of collapsed tunnels or unpaid widows. Local radio hosts call it Le Mirage Doré, the golden mirage, something shimmering on the horizon that retreats every time a thirsty traveler steps closer. In Houndé, a widow named Salamata keeps her husband's helmet on a shelf above the cooking fire. She taps it each morning for luck before walking 3 kilometers to sell roasted peanuts outside the mine gate. The helmet still bears a smear of grease and the faded letters WGM, Western Gold Mining, yet Salamata has never seen the inside of a hospital the company promised to build. That line item vanished somewhere between a shareholder meeting in Toronto and a courier envelope full of consulting fees. And so the cycle spins. Bulldozers chew deeper, export figures soar, quarterly dividends sparkle. Children trace the outline of haul trucks in the dust and dream of sitting in an air-conditioned cab, unaware that the steering wheels will never turn for them. The CEOs toast another record year from penthouse balconies in Johannesburg and Geneva, their phones buzzing with congratulatory messages from bankers. A world apart, a miner named Isu Fu coughs crimson into a rag and ties it back over his mouth. Tomorrow is another shift, and gold like a ghost will keep calling. Soon, however, the ghost will be confronted. The mirage will face the one man who refuses to believe that fences, ledgers, or polished press releases can hide the truth forever. And when Ibrahim Traoré steps across that invisible line, the gold of Burkina Faso will no longer be a rumor whispered through wire mesh. It will become a reckoning. Long before the arrests, before the sirens fell silent and the CEOs were dragged from their silk-sheeted lives, Ibrahim Traoré was already at war, but it was a war fought in silence, waged in shadows, and built on data. What the world would come to see as a sudden eruption of justice had, in truth, been months in the making. And it all began with a question he asked behind closed doors, in a bare office lit by a single desk lamp. Where is the gold really going? That question became an obsession. And from that obsession, Traoré formed what would later be called Le Cercle, a covert task force of the most unlikely minds. An international law professor who had once challenged corporate mining rights at The Hague, a quiet hacker with a criminal record and unmatched encryption skills, and a retired geological engineer who had spent 2 decades working as a consultant for 3 of the very companies now under scrutiny. Together they formed a triangle of expertise: law, data, and the earth itself. Their mission was clear: prove what everyone suspected, but no one had ever dared to expose. First, they mapped every operational mine in the country using high-resolution satellite imagery. They cross-referenced official production reports with drone footage and thermal scans that showed heat signatures of processing facilities. The results were baffling. In dozens of sites, the energy output and processing scale far exceeded what companies were declaring on paper. Some operations were running double shifts, others had expanded beyond their permitted boundaries. Aerial footage showed convoys leaving mines under cover of night, taking tailings that, when analyzed, were still rich in gold. Gold that never made it to the books. Next came the paperwork. The hacker, known only as Rafik, breached servers across 5 continents, encrypted data vaults in Switzerland, shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, internal Slack messages from executives who thought they were untouchable. He decrypted 5 years of communication and uncovered a deliberate pattern of export underreporting, invoice fraud, and offshore transfers. One folder changed everything. It was innocuously labeled GTP Alternate Ops. Inside were files showing that since 2002, over $500 billion worth of gold had been extracted from Burkina soil, a number that dwarfed the country's entire GDP. Yet of that staggering figure, only $10 billion had ever been formally declared to the National Treasury. The rest? Hidden behind forged paperwork, shell companies, and in-kind development promises that never materialized. Traoré didn't react with anger. He reacted with strategy. He ordered the placement of internal informants within major mining sites, disguised as workers, drivers, even cleaners. They wore body cams, tracked irregular movement of ore trucks, and photographed undocumented shifts. In one particularly damning case, an informant recorded a training session where a Western executive taught local accountants how to manipulate grading reports, lowering declared purity to reduce royalty fees. The footage was sent directly to Le Cercle's secure server. No edits, no doubt. No. The engineer, Balo, then reconstructed accurate output estimates using seismic readouts, rock density samples, and extraction depth logs. In site after site, the numbers didn't just misalign, They contradicted reality. Companies were declaring 1 ton of daily output, while geological data and satellite-fed models suggested production closer to 10 tons per day. Every detail was cataloged. Every irregularity became a line in a growing document. Crimes of extraction, a case against Western mining in Burkina Faso. Over 3,000 pages long, filled with signatures, satellite overlays, interview transcripts, drone coordinates, shipping logs, and financial trails. Then, Traoré moved to secure legal validation. He flew a select team of judges and legal scholars from Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia to a private retreat. No phones, no press, just hard evidence and long conversations. When they emerged 5 days later, their decision was unanimous. This constitutes systematic economic aggression. These are not just tax violations. These are crimes against humanity. That statement sealed it. From that point on, Traoré knew what he had to do. The press would call him a radical. The West would call him a dictator. But the numbers didn't lie. The earth had been bleeding gold for decades, and his people were still drinking from rusted buckets. The only path left was the one no leader before him had dared to walk. Hold them accountable. All of them. And he would do it not with speeches, but with proof. The kind no courtroom could ignore, and no corporation could bury. Justice, after all, begins in silence. But not for long. Musa was 8 the first time he was lowered into the dark. No helmet, no gloves, just a frayed rope around his waist, calloused hands above holding the line, and a whisper in his ear, "Don't drop the lamp." The shaft was no more than a meter wide, barely enough for his small frame to squeeze through. As he descended, the sunlight disappeared inch by inch until all that remained was the flickering flame of a kerosene lamp and the crushing weight of earth above. At first he couldn't breathe. The air was thick, sour with chemical fumes, and the bitter stench of old dynamite. The tunnel walls sweated moisture, mixing with the fine dust kicked up by digging tools. Musa's job was to crawl through narrow gaps, retrieve fragments of ore too tight for grown men to reach, and carry them back in woven sacks twice his weight. His arms ached constantly. His knees bled. He didn't complain. Complaining got you replaced. He wasn't alone. The pit was filled with children, most under 12, their faces gray with dust, lips cracked, eyes wide with something far older than fear. They spoke in whispers, if at all, their voices ragged from the toxic mist that never seemed to settle. The mining company insisted these were community apprenticeships. On paper, none of them existed. In reality, they formed the backbone of the informal labor force that worked the unregistered shafts, cheap, invisible, and expendable. There was no water down there, no rest breaks, only the occasional hiss of hydraulic drills from deeper levels and the clang of rock against metal. Sometimes the lights flickered, sometimes the air would thicken without warning, and the boys would press rags over their mouths, hoping it wasn't another cyanide leak from the adjacent processing zone. No one explained what cyanide was. They only knew it burned your throat and made your eyes feel like they were melting. Musa remembered the day his friend Salif died. Salif had just turned 9. He was quick, always smiling, always the first to dive into the tighter spaces. That morning, the walls were unusually damp. A quiet drip echoed through the tunnel, steady and slow. Then a rumble, just a tremor at first, then another. The roof cracked without warning. A spray of dust shot out like a cannon blast. Musa turned just in time to see Salif's lamp fall, the flame vanish and the rocks close in. They dug for hours, hands clawing at mud and timber. When they found Salif, his arms were raised as if trying to shield his face. His mouth was still open. He didn't look peaceful. He looked betrayed. No one from the company came. The foreman shrugged. "Unfortunate," he said. They were back in the pit by morning. Now 17, Musa no longer fits in the tighter gaps. His lungs rattle when he coughs. He hasn't slept through the night in years. When he testified in the courtroom, standing before foreign judges and cameras he'd never imagined, he didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply said, "They stole my childhood. They stole my friend. They stole our breath and our time and our names." And then he paused, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought the darkness was the worst part, But it wasn't. The worst part was knowing they knew and still sent us in. In that moment, the room was silent. The camera shutters clicked, but no one dared move. Because behind Moose's quiet voice was a truth sharper than any pickaxe. That buried beneath the gold was something far more precious and far more broken. The lives of children who were never meant to be minors, but were forced to become ghosts. For months, Le Cercle had chased rumors, whispers in loading bays, screenshots from disgruntled accountants, half-deleted audit logs, but nothing compared to the night Rafik pierced the final firewall. The server sat in a climate-controlled data bunker outside Zurich, shielded by 3 tiers of encryption and a $500,000 contract with a cybersecurity firm whose motto boasted, "Secrets stay safe." At 2:17 GMT, that motto died. Packets slipped through a backdoor exploit, keys unraveled, and a black window on Rafik's laptop began dumping raw text faster than any eye could read. By dawn, he was staring at 33 gigabytes of corporate sin, neatly arranged in folders named Executive Communications, Tax Strategy, and most damning of all, Local Relations. The first email Traoré read came from Viktor Petrov to his CFO, time-stamped 2 days after a miners' protest that had left 3 men shot by private security. "Relax. We pay them peanuts. They worship us. By next week, they'll be back underground begging for overtime." Attached was a photo of a champagne bottle popping against the sunset, Petrov celebrating quarterly profits that had just crossed the billion-dollar mark. A second thread showed Jean-Claude Dubois forwarding a hiring directive to HR. Find more locals, young, desperate, cheap. Training optional, safety gear minimized. The margin matters. Minutes later, an HR manager replied, "Understood. Helmets can be reissued every 3rd quarter to cut cost." Dubois answered with a single emoji. Thumbs up. Rafik scrolled deeper. The files grew uglier. One PowerPoint slide titled, "Optimizing Community Perception," advised executives never to use the word slave in writing, but offered alternatives like involuntary overtime and extended productivity cycles. Another slide, decorated with stock photos of smiling African children, recommended donating expired antibiotics to local clinics because they count as full retail value for charitable deductions. Yet numbers, not slurs, delivered the killing blow. Hidden in Tax Strategy Q4 was a spreadsheet mapping our shipments against a tangle of shell companies from Luxembourg to the Seychelles. Columns marked real grade and reported grade sat side by side. In row after row, gold purity was quietly downgraded from 92% to 47%, slashing declared value in half. Customs forms were then routed through a freight forwarder that lost 3 out of every 10 containers in transit. Losses reimbursed by an insurer that never examined the cargo. The missing gold slipped into refineries under fresh paperwork and re-emerged on international markets. Spotless, untraceable, taxable nowhere. $500 billion siphoned, $10 billion declared. The ledger read like a crime novel where the villain wins every chapter. Still, the contempt bled beyond balance sheets. In an internal Slack channel named #DailyBanter, a junior analyst posted a meme of a shivering miner captioned, "Gold fever, not the rich kind." The reaction line filled with laughing emojis from senior staff. Later that week, when cyanide wastewater spilled into a tributary near Toparco, Operations Chief Peter Williams typed, "Nature will heal itself. Natives drink mud anyway." 11 executives reacted with the party horn emoji. Traoré read these lines in silence, jaw locked so tight a vein stood out on his temple. He printed screenshots on heavy stock paper, proof you could feel, and laid them across a war room table already cluttered with satellite photos and whistleblower affidavits. Each page felt radioactive. Every word dripped with the arrogance of people convinced impunity was permanent. But the real smoking gun appeared in a confidential PDF labeled Project Mirror. It detailed a carousel invoice scheme, ore sold internally from the Burkina subsidiary to a Dubai shell at a 90% discount, then resold to the Swiss parent at market price, generating paper losses in Africa and paper gains in tax havens. A side note explained how to rotate auditors every 18 months. Prevents relationships, limits curiosity. When the retired engineer Balo cross-checked her tonnage against geology models, the gap became a canyon. One mine allegedly produced 12,000 ounces in 2019. Thermal imaging showed enough activity to process at least 10 times that amount. In a margin note, an executive joked, "If satellites had feelings, we'd be screwed." They were about to find out satellites weren't the ones they should fear. By the time the task force finished cataloging, they had 412 explicit admissions of wage theft, 127 directives to falsify invoices, and 64 separate uses of the phrases "stupid natives" or "cheap labor," all time-stamped, all signed. There was no room for legal acrobatics, no PR spin big enough to bury so much rot. Traoré closed the last folder, eyes dark but steady. "They called my people stupid," he said, voice a low growl. "Let's show them the cost of underestimating the quiet." Then he turned to his team, tapped the printed pile of emails, and issued a single, final order. Prepare the chains. That night, Rafik uploaded an encrypted backup to 3 offshore servers. Balo packed the geological dossiers into a steel case, and the law professor drafted a memorandum whose title alone made every corporation's blood run cold. Exhibit A, Evidence of Systematic Human Exploitation and Grand Larceny. The hidden emails were hidden no more. They had become the fuse, and Ibrahim Traoré was already holding the match. For all the fake invoices and offshore tricks, the real machinery of plunder in Burkina Faso ran not on code or satellites, but on something older, simpler, cash in envelopes and handshakes in back rooms. The mining empires may have looked corporate on the outside, but at their core, they operated like old-world cartels: buy influence, bury opposition, and break whoever stood in the way. The bribes were never written in official memos. They were hidden behind consulting fees, overseas scholarships, and donations to civic development funds. But Rafik's digital excavation had exposed more than emails. Deep in a forgotten archive folder marked Legacy Transitions, he found a password-protected directory containing video files, signed contracts, and private audio recordings. What they revealed was nothing short of systemic corruption that reached into the very heart of government. The first scandal centered around Marc Carbu, the former Minister of Energy and Mines. A man known for his polished French suits and frequent trips to Dubai, Carbu had publicly positioned himself as a reformer, a clean technocrat with big plans for partnership-driven growth. But the reality was far uglier. In a 2015 video recorded secretly by a Goldmax executive, likely as insurance, Carbu can be seen sitting in a leather armchair at a beachside villa, sipping champagne while flipping through a contract. 30% tax? The exec asks off camera. Carbu smirks. Unacceptable. The exec slides a folder across the table. Inside, $50 million in bearer bonds. Carbu taps the papers and says with a laugh, "Let's call it 3% for the sake of friendship." And so it was done. Goldmax's tax burden dropped by 90% overnight, costing the country an estimated $2 billion annually. In exchange, Carbu purchased 2 high-rise condos in Abu Dhabi and disappeared from public life 6 months later. But the largest and most damning deal involved François Caboret, the brother of then-President Roch-Marc Christian Caboret. François had no official title, no government portfolio, but everyone knew he was the gatekeeper to mining licenses. He controlled the National Committee for Strategic Resource Development, a committee in name only, whose decisions were made over private dinners and closed-door yacht cruises. In 2017, Western Gold Mining wanted access to 3 virgin gold zones in the southern province, rich in ore and dangerously close to protected ancestral lands. They knew the application wouldn't survive public scrutiny, so they didn't file one. Instead, they scheduled a private meeting with François at his estate outside Bobo Dioulasso. Le Cercle retrieved the bank wire confirmation, $100 million transferred to a holding company in the British Virgin Islands, less than 24 hours before the committee approved WGM's exploratory license. Within weeks, bulldozers arrived, and over 50,000 villagers were forcibly evicted. Crops were torched, graves bulldozed, a culture erased in the name of extraction. The final nail came in the form of a leaked video, recorded by a whistleblower who worked security for the mining company. It showed executives and Burkina Faso intermediaries laughing over whiskey in a private club in Dakar, celebrating a successful clearance. One man raised a toast to efficiency, less noise, less resistance. Another chimed in, and cheaper too. Do you know how much we save by not negotiating resettlement? Dead land, dead people, no paperwork. In the background of the video, visible through a window, a convoy of displaced villagers trudged past, clutching sacks, children trailing behind barefoot. The timing wasn't coincidence. The meeting had been scheduled on the very day the eviction occurred. The laughter from inside felt like thunder in the face of a storm no one else was allowed to hear. When Traoré watched the footage, he didn't speak for several minutes. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, his brow furrowed but unreadable. Finally, he turned to the prosecutor beside him and said, "I want every name, every signature, every account." His voice wasn't angry, it was surgical. Within 48 hours, the financial trail was frozen. Interpol warrants were drafted for both Carbu and François Caboret. The judge from Mali nodded solemnly as she read the list of violations: grand corruption, abuse of office, conspiracy to commit economic crimes against the people. What shocked the people most wasn't that corruption had happened. It was that someone was finally calling it by its name and doing something about it. The bribe machine had turned for decades, grinding trust into ash, spitting out polished reports for foreign investors while bleeding a nation dry. But the gears were rusting now. Its operators were unmasked. And for the first time, the men who had once toasted their impunity now found themselves staring at subpoenas instead of champagne. Justice, long ignored, was knocking. And this time, it wasn't asking permission. They used to call it the River Sana. It ran cool and clear through a dozen villages in the eastern province, winding past rice fields, mango trees, and schoolyards where children once chased each other barefoot in the sun. Mothers came to wash their clothes there, elders dipped gourds to drink, and fishermen cast nets at dawn hoping for silver glints in the water. It wasn't just a river, it was a spine of life. And then one morning, it changed color. The water turned pale, almost ghostly. The fish floated belly up. Goats refused to drink. Then came the coughs. At first, villagers blamed dust storms or the change of seasons. But then children stopped eating. Women complained of chest pain. Men began to vomit blood. The local clinic was overwhelmed. 4 bags ran dry. A visiting doctor took samples to Ouagadougou. The test came back: cyanide contamination. Investigators traced the source upstream, where a sprawling open-pit mine, run by Australian Pacific Resources, under the leadership of Michael Thompson, sat perched over the watershed. Drone footage confirmed what locals already knew. Wastewater had been dumped directly and deliberately into tributaries feeding the Sana. No containment, no filtration, just a sluice gate opened wide. Over 2,000 people died within 2 years, some within weeks. Others lingered, skin yellowing, eyes sunken, breath shallow. Most were never diagnosed. They couldn't afford it. In one of the courtroom's most harrowing testimonies, a woman named Mariam Senyon stood trembling as she unfolded a worn photograph. It showed 3 boys, ages 6, 9, and 11, her sons, all gone. "I gave birth to them at home," she said, voice brittle. "I raised them with river water and prayers. They used to swim at sunset. They used to laugh." She paused, holding back tears. "Now I sit alone. My house is quiet. My arms are empty." The court went still. No cameras flashed. Even the stenographer hesitated, blinking hard before typing again. Thompson never looked up. He had claimed earlier that he was unaware of the chemical protocols, that any discharge had been unintentional, the result of local mismanagement. But Le Cercle presented internal memos that proved otherwise, emails between Thompson and logistics managers that outlined cost-cutting alternatives to proper waste treatment. One chilling line read, "Local resistance is weak. If runoff occurs, it's unlikely anyone will trace it back to us. Besides, they've been drinking dirty water for generations." Rafik had unearthed a safety audit, never filed, which warned explicitly of lethal contamination risk if tailing ponds overflowed. Thompson signed off on the bypass system that rerouted overflow directly into the riverbed. He also signed the quarterly report that declared zero environmental incidents. At the International Tribunal, Traoré leaned into the microphone during cross-examination. His voice was calm, but his eyes flared with something deeper than fury: moral rage. If this had happened in Europe, he said, scanning the rows of foreign press, they would call it genocide. They would send war crimes investigators. They would not call it a compliance failure. They would call it what it is: a crime against humanity. No one spoke. The prosecution concluded with aerial images of villages along the Sana, before and after. Once green, now gray. Once alive, now skeletal. Underneath the photos was a single sentence, printed in bold: "The river never forgot. Neither will we." For the people who lived there, the river was not just poisoned, it was silenced. And in that silence, the world almost moved on. Almost, but not this time. Not while Traoré stood, not while Mariam still held her photo, not while truth had breath left in it. Because water remembers, and justice, though delayed, had finally found its way downstream. The building had once been a colonial courthouse, its stone walls weathered, its wooden beams darkened by time and whispers. For decades it had stood as a symbol of foreign control, a place where laws were handed down but rarely upheld for the benefit of the people. Now the flags on its steps were different. The brass plaque had been replaced. The locks on the doors were new. This was no longer a relic of subjugation. It was now the beating heart of something unprecedented: Burkina Faso's Special Tribunal for Economic Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity. Inside the main chamber, the layout defied tradition. The bench was not raised above the floor. The judges sat at eye level with the accused, 7 in total, selected with surgical precision. 3 from Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Ghana. 2 from Asia, India and the Philippines. 2 from Latin America, Colombia and Argentina. All of them experienced in corruption cases, none of them handpicked by Western courts. This was intentional, deliberate, symbolic. No voice from Europe or North America sat in judgment, not because they were unwelcome, but because, for once, Africa would speak first. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Streets that once echoed with frustration now buzzed with hope. Vendors pushed carts filled with roasted peanuts and cold bissap. Children sat on shoulders. Old men leaned on canes and stared at the towering LED screens mounted in city squares, their eyes blinking with disbelief. It wasn't just Ouagadougou. Every major city in the country, Bobo Dioulasso, Koudougou, Kaya, had screens streaming the trial live. Radios crackled in farming villages. Projectors flickered in schools. For the first time in modern history, the people of Burkina Faso were watching justice unfold in real time. And it was their justice. The defendants were brought in one by one. Victor Petrov, once the untouchable head of Goldmax Corporation, now stood in a wrinkled suit, hands cuffed. His eyes darted to the cameras. Jean-Claude Dubois, arrogant to the last moment, scoffed at the translators, muttering under his breath in French. Michael Thompson looked thinner, haunted by months in prison. Alongside them stood 4 others: Mackenzie, Harrison, Williams, Anderson, each representing a different empire, each wearing the same look of disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it was happening. The lead judge, Justice Awa Coulibaly, a towering figure from Mali with 30 years of legal experience and a reputation for incorruptibility, opened the proceedings with a single statement, one that echoed across every speaker, every screen, every heart. This court does not serve the powerful, it serves the truth, and today the truth belongs to the people of this land. The defense teams, flown in at great expense and clearly uncomfortable in the non-Western setting, attempted to challenge jurisdiction, but it was already too late. Burkina Faso's parliament had voted unanimously to empower the tribunal. The African Union had issued full legal recognition. Even the United Nations, albeit quietly, had acknowledged the court's legitimacy. No loophole could delay what was already rolling forward like a freight train. Witnesses had been called. Evidence had been prepared. Each defendant faced hundreds of charges, with the prosecution splitting the case into 4 main pillars: economic exploitation, environmental destruction, forced displacement, and crimes against human dignity. Behind the judges hung a single banner, deep crimson, with 7 gold words embroidered in mossy and French. No more silence, no more shadows, no more selling us. Traoré sat quietly in the first row, wearing a plain uniform with no military insignia. He wasn't there to lead the court. He was there to listen, to witness, to be held accountable by the same laws he was restoring. The cameras often panned to him, and when they did, the faces in the crowds watching thousands of miles away would light up, not with idol worship, but with something rarer: recognition. This court, in every sense, was not just about punishment. It was about something larger than retribution: restoration, restoring faith in the law, restoring dignity to the land, restoring the idea that even the richest men, from the tallest towers, could be brought to kneel before the people they had once ignored. As the gavel struck for the first time, the sound did not merely echo inside the courtroom. It echoed across the continent, because Africa was not just watching, Africa was judging. When the court reconvened on the second day, the energy in the room had shifted. The shock of seeing powerful CEOs in the dock had passed. Now came the harder part: the testimony, the truth, not in numbers or documents, but in voices. Some trembling, some hoarse from years of silence, but all unshakably real. The first to take the stand was Mariam Coulibaly, a 72-year-old woman with deep lines etched into her cheeks like dry riverbeds. She wore a faded headscarf and walked slowly, supported by a cane and a younger relative. As she sat, the court hushed. Even the defense lawyers stopped shuffling papers. Something about her presence demanded reverence. With a quiet dignity, Mariam began to speak, not in French or English, but in Moray, her native tongue. A translator's voice echoed over the speakers as she recounted the day her village disappeared. "We had lived there for generations," she said, her voice calm but steady. "The trees were planted by my grandmother. The graves of our ancestors sat on the hill above the rice fields. One day, men in hard hats came with maps and machines. They said the land was no longer ours." She paused, fingers trembling around a beaded bracelet. "They gave us an envelope. Inside was a contract I could not read, and the equivalent of $100 for our land, for our graves." The courtroom was silent. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. "They bulldozed everything: our houses, our school, even the little shrine where we prayed for rain. I begged them to let us move the bones of our ancestors. They said we had 1 hour. The defense objected briefly, citing hearsay. The judge overruled without hesitation. Mariam reached into her cloth bag and pulled out a small tin box. She opened it slowly to reveal a handful of white fragments, bone shards from her family's grave, gathered after the demolition. She held them up, hands shaking, for the entire court to see. "They were not just bones," she said. "They were memory, and they threw them away like garbage." Gasps rippled through the viewing plazas outside. Thousands watched as Mariam was helped down from the witness chair, her testimony complete, but her presence lingering like incense in the air. The second witness was Amira Diallo, a 10-year-old girl with burned scars trailing down her arms and across her neck. She wore a yellow dress and pink sandals, legs swinging nervously as she sat. Her mother stood beside her, gently squeezing her shoulder. Amira's voice was soft, barely audible. "I was playing with my brother by the river," she said. "He told me not to go in, but I was hot, so I splashed water on my face." She paused, lips trembling. "It started burning right away. I screamed and he ran to get Mama. They washed me with soap, but it got worse." The prosecution showed a photo of the site, a downstream waterway laced with cyanide and heavy metals, the same one Pacific Resources had been warned to contain. A medical report confirmed that Amira had suffered third-degree chemical burns from industrial runoff. She would carry the scars for life. Traoré didn't blink. Neither did the judges. "I can't go to school now," Amira said. "The other kids stare." Her mother leaned down and whispered something. The girl nodded. "But I came here because someone said the men who did this would have to listen." She looked straight at the row of executives, her gaze piercing, even through the innocence of her age. "You're listening now, right?" No one in the courtroom moved. Cameras zoomed in on the rows of the accused. Thompson looked away. Petrov clenched his jaw. Dubois stared at the floor. For the first time, the weight of their decisions, once buried under spreadsheets and legal armor, sat in the air like smoke. The final voice came not from a witness chair, but a recording, played on the courtroom speakers. It was the voice of a young miner named Isufu, who had died 2 weeks earlier from lung failure. He had recorded a final message before passing, with help from a nurse. "If I die, let them know I was not a number. I was not cheap labor. I was a brother, a son. I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to see the sea." The playback ended. There were no words, just breathe. Heavy, silent breath. And that silence, deeper than the law, older than the courtroom, was not weakness. It was the sound of something awakening, of grief becoming fire, of forgotten voices rising at last. As the weight of witness testimony settled like a storm cloud over the courtroom, the men who once ruled over boardrooms and billion-dollar budgets began to unravel. Their tailored suits hung loose. Their eyes darted. The polished arrogance that had followed them into the chamber was cracking, and the cracks were widening fast. It started with Michael Thompson. On the fourth day of proceedings, just minutes before the session resumed, he collapsed in the hallway outside the courtroom, clutching his chest and gasping for breath. His lawyer shouted for help, and guards rushed to assist. But Traoré, already on site and watching, didn't move. He signaled to a military medic, a woman in her 50s who had once treated mine collapse victims with nothing but gauze and boiled water. She examined Thompson calmly, ignoring the sweat on his brow and the theatrics in his eyes. 10 minutes later, she gave her diagnosis. No signs of cardiac distress, heartbeat stable, lungs clear, just fear or performance. "Get him a chair," Traoré said. "He'll need it. The day's only just begun." Later that afternoon, Jean-Claude Dubois' legal team submitted a formal motion for bail. The offer, $1 billion, wired in full, no conditions. His lawyers argued that he posed no flight risk, that he would surrender his passport and remain under surveillance. But the moment the figure was announced in court, a ripple of disbelief swept through the public viewing squares. People stared at each other, stunned, not by the generosity of the offer, but by the audacity. Traoré rose slowly, every eye on him. He walked to the center of the courtroom, not with rage, but with a composure that made the moment all the more chilling. "$1 billion, he said. $1 billion is what you offer in exchange for the lives of my people?" He paused. "You stole 50 times that, and you didn't just steal money. You stole futures. You stole lungs from our children. You stole water from our rivers. You stole graves from our ancestors. You cannot pay that back, not with all the money in all your banks." He turned to the bench of judges, voice low but cutting. "There is no bail. There is no bargain. There is only justice, and it will be served in full." No one argued, not the lawyers, not the accused, not even the cameras. And then came the moment the world had been waiting for. The lead prosecutor, flanked by a team of legal experts and analysts, stepped forward with a stack of documents so thick it had to be wheeled in on a cart. Each file bore a cover sheet marked in red. "Confirmed charges, finalized." The judge asked for the total. The prosecutor lifted his microphone, cleared his throat, and read the number aloud. 1,042 criminal counts across 7 defendants. The courtroom held its breath. Charges included grand theft of national resources, tax evasion, bribery of public officials, environmental destruction, manslaughter by negligence, conspiracy to displace civilian populations, employment of underage labor in hazardous conditions, and willful cover-up of toxic dumping resulting in mass death. One by one, the names were read alongside the charges. Victor Petrov, 234 counts. Jean-Claude Dubois, 189 counts. Michael Thompson, 206 counts. Robert McKenzie, 124 counts. James Harrison, 118 counts. Peter Williams, 84 counts. David Anderson, 87 counts. Each name struck like a bell, reverberating through the chamber and out across the country, where screens glowed and radios buzzed and old men whispered. They said this day would never come. But it had. And if there was mercy once, it had been buried long ago, Beneath the rubble, the poisoned soil, and the broken backs of a people who had waited too long to be heard. Now mercy was no longer on offer. What remained was truth. What followed would be reckoning. The sun was barely rising over Ouagadougou when crowds began to gather outside the courthouse. Vendors handed out cups of hot millet porridge. Young boys climbed onto walls for a better view of the screens. The atmosphere was tense but electrified. Today was the day justice would speak aloud. Inside the special tribunal, the chamber was packed. No one spoke. No cameras flashed. Even the defendants, once arrogantly dismissive, now sat rigid and pale. This was the final chapter of a trial unlike any the continent or the world had ever seen. At exactly 10 a.m., Chief Judge Awa Coulibaly entered. Behind her, the 6 other judges took their seats, robes crisp, expressions unreadable. On the desk before them sat 7 thick verdict folders, each bearing a name in bold black letters. No theatrics, no delay. The court clerk stood and began to read. Victor Petrov, Chief Executive Officer of Goldmax Corporation. The room held its breath. On 234 counts of criminal conspiracy, bribery of public officials, falsification of export records, forced displacement of populations, and negligent homicide by environmental destruction. She paused just for a second and then, "You are hereby sentenced to 50 years in maximum security prison in order to pay a fine of $10 billion to be recovered through the full liquidation of your global assets." There was no reaction from Petrov. His lips parted slightly. His shoulders slumped forward, the weight of the moment pulling him inward, like gravity. Behind him, a lawyer quietly lowered his pen. Then came the next name, Jean-Claude Dubois, CEO of Western Gold Mining. On 189 counts, including child labor exploitation, forgery of safety documents, illegal acquisition of protected lands, and participation in grand-scale environmental fraud, you are sentenced to 45 years imprisonment and fined $8 billion. Dubois' face turned ashen. He stood abruptly, began to speak, but his voice cracked before a single word came out. His knees gave way. 2 guards caught him before he collapsed. The clerk continued, her voice unwavering. Michael Thompson, Executive of Pacific Resources. On 206 counts, including intentional contamination of public water systems with cyanide, resulting in the deaths of over 2,000 individuals, you are sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There was a gasp from the gallery. Even in a trial filled with horror, this sentence felt like the final nail. Robert Mackenzie, 40 years. James Harrison, 55 years. Peter Williams, 60 years. David Anderson, life without parole for financing armed militias and aiding violent displacement. And then came the final declaration, spoken not by the clerk, but by Judge Coulibaly herself. All personal and corporate assets of the defendants shall be confiscated in full, including but not limited to private jets, yachts, villas, accounts, and undisclosed holdings in offshore trusts. The proceeds shall be transferred to a national reparations fund and distributed directly to the families of the victims. As the crowd outside heard those words broadcast live, they erupted, not in riot, but in tears, cheers, and chants. Children on rooftops clapped. Grandmothers hugged strangers. The screen at the city square flickered momentarily before refocusing on the trembling face of James Harrison, who was now sobbing openly at the defense table. Inside the courtroom, a moment of human collapse unfolded. Victor Petrov's jaw clenched and he began to shake, not from rage, but from shock. Dubois, still on his knees, wept with his hands covering his face. Thompson stared straight ahead, unmoving. No trace of the empire builder remained, just a ghost of a man, sentenced by the very people he once considered invisible. And then came the question no one expected. A guard stepped forward and asked if any of the defendants wished to address the court. Only one stood. David Anderson, hair disheveled, voice raw, whispered through cracked lips, "Please, let my children keep the house." Judge Coulibaly looked at him, unwavering. "Your children will live. The children you displaced, the children who died digging for your gold. They did not." She banged the gavel once, and the room exploded. Not in noise, but in a silence so profound it felt like justice itself had taken a breath. And as the prisoners were led away, no longer CEOs, no longer untouchable, the final verdict hung in the air, heavier than gold, louder than power. Africa is no longer for sale. The day after the verdicts were handed down, the streets of Ouagadougou did not erupt in celebration. They breathed. A quiet calm swept through the city, not born of relief, but of something far rarer, hope with roots. People weren't just reacting to what had ended. They were ready to build what was next. At the National Assembly, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a sea of lawmakers, journalists, teachers, and miners. Gone were the camouflage fatigues. He wore a simple white tunic, a symbol not of power, but of responsibility. His voice was measured, deliberate. Our gold, he began, has finally come home, and it will never leave us again. That afternoon, he signed into law the most ambitious economic transformation in Burkina Faso's modern history: the establishment of the Burkinabe National Mining Company, BNMC, a fully state-owned enterprise controlled not by foreign boards or anonymous investors, but by the people. Its mission was clear: extract resources, reinvest revenues, and restore dignity. 70% of all profits would be earmarked for three sacred pillars: education, healthcare, and national infrastructure. The remaining 30% would fund worker protections, operational efficiency, and a sovereign wealth reserve. No money would leave the country without purpose. No ounce of gold would be shipped without trace. The world's financial analysts predicted collapse. Nationalization will bankrupt them, they wrote. It will scare off investors. But within months, the numbers told a different story. Gold output remained steady. Revenue skyrocketed. Corruption vanished. BNMC didn't build glass towers or buy foreign soccer teams. Instead, they built futures. Within the first 12 months, 500 new schools were constructed, some in towns that had never had a chalkboard, let alone classrooms. 200 rural clinics and hospitals were opened, equipped with modern tools, solar power, and trained local staff. Over 3 million people across 2,000 villages received clean, drinkable water for the first time in their lives. One evening, a national broadcast showed a girl in the northern village of Arbinda washing her face at a new pump station. The look in her eyes wasn't just joy, it was freedom. At a newly opened hospital in Farangourma, a nurse held up a healthy newborn and whispered to a camera crew, "Before this, women gave birth by candlelight. Now we have light, now we have life." The transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional, cultural. Children who once worked underground were now learning to read, to code, to dream. Schools introduced science classes, history and local languages, and even geology labs where students studied the same gold-bearing rocks their ancestors once mined by hand. Traoré didn't disappear into a palace or retreat behind red velvet curtains. He visited the first new school on its opening day, handing out pencils and shaking hands. He stood in line at a rural clinic to greet the first mother vaccinated under the new program. He met with engineers overseeing solar grids in formerly dark villages, asking questions not like a president, but like a curious brother. The world began to pay attention, not because of war, famine, or instability, but because something worked. Newspapers in South America and Asia ran headlines like "The Burkinabe Model" and "From Exploitation to Empowerment." Delegations arrived to study BNMC's revenue model. Leaders in Mali, Guinea, and Niger began adapting similar frameworks. Across the continent, whispers grew louder. Why not us? Inside Burkina Faso, a national slogan began to appear on murals, chalkboards, and children's backpacks. Our gold builds our future. For decades, gold had left the country in crates and plains, enriching the lives of men continents away. Now it paved roads, filled hospitals, and poured into textbooks. The land was finally yielding not just wealth, but well-being. And at the heart of it stood a company with no offshore accounts, no golden parachutes, just a promise. This time, the people come first. It didn't begin with fireworks or official speeches. It began with a child, barefoot, eyes bright, holding a brand new school book to his chest like it was a treasure map. He skipped through the red dirt streets of a small village just outside Koudougou, shouting to anyone who would listen, "I'm going to school! I'm going to school!" Others joined. Children who once carried pickaxes now carried pencils. Their hands no longer blistered from breaking rocks, but smudged with ink from practicing letters. Mothers wept quietly on porches, watching their sons and daughters walk off not to work, but to learn. In the capital, Ouagadougou, drums echoed through the neighborhoods. Entire streets transformed into celebration. Women in bright fabrics danced in circles, ululating with joy. Men painted the words, "Our gold, our future," across market walls. Vendors handed out free roasted maize. Teenagers created songs, rap, verses, and traditional chants woven into one rising voice. The name that kept repeating again and again, like a chorus in the wind, Traoré, Traoré, Traoré. It wasn't the chant of worship. It wasn't politics. It was something deeper: recognition, respect, gratitude. This wasn't just about a leader. This was about finally seeing themselves in power. On the main boulevard, a mural was being painted. It showed a girl lifting a book in one hand, with a mine entrance behind her and the sun rising ahead. Above her, the words were scrawled in bold white letters, "From dust to dignity." In the quiet village of Bani, an old man named Issa Zungrana, stooped with age, sat beneath a baobab tree watching children run past him, laughing. He had seen war. He had seen drought. He had seen leaders promise and vanish. But this was different. He turned to a young journalist recording reactions and said, voice gravelly but certain, "I am seeing a future I never believed in. I did not think I would live to see it." He smiled, toothless and wide. But here it is. Look at them. Across the country, villages held small festivals. Homemade banners hung between trees. Chickens were roasted. People shared radios and phones, replaying the courtroom footage and interviews with nurses, teachers, farmers. Even the hills seemed to hum with something ancient being restored. Pride. And somewhere, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, without guards or podiums, was Ibrahim Traoré. No fanfare, no speech, just a quiet presence, watching it all unfold. The children laughing, the elders weeping, the workers clapping their dust-free hands to the rhythm of joy. A woman noticed him first, then another, and then the wave began. One by one, voices rose, not rehearsed, not directed, just spontaneous song, lifting from every corner of the street. "He brought back our gold. He brought back our hope. Traoré, the people's man. No more chains, only books in our hands." Traoré didn't raise his fist. He didn't wave. He simply nodded, eyes glassy, heart full. And in that moment, beneath the setting sun, the streets weren't just singing, they were healing. The verdicts in Burkina Faso did not end at the border. They echoed, like thunder rolling across the savannah, like a call long buried finally breaking free. And across Africa, leaders, activists, and citizens heard it. The first ripple came from Mali, just weeks after the sentencing in Ouagadougou. In a dawn raid strikingly similar to the one Traoré had orchestrated, Malian authorities arrested the CEO of Saharaco Mining, a foreign-owned company accused of underreporting gold exports for over a decade. No warning, no press conference, just decisive action. Headlines called it the Bamako shock. Days later in Guinea, President Mamadi Doumbouya signed an emergency decree, the nationalization of all bauxite mining operations. Helicopters hovered over remote extraction sites as state engineers took control. For years, Guinea had produced the world's largest supply of bauxite, yet schools there had dirt floors and no roofs. "That ends today," the president declared. And then came Niger. For decades, the country's uranium fueled French nuclear power, but its own people lived by candlelight. In a stunning announcement, Niger terminated all existing uranium contracts with France, citing gross imbalance and neo-colonial terms. Social media exploded. Crowds poured into Niamey's streets, waving signs that read, "Our minerals are not for your lights, they are for our future." A movement was taking shape. Online, the hashtag #AfricaRising trended in over 20 countries. Young people across the continent shared stories of stolen wealth, broken promises, and newfound resolve. Posts featured images of school children, solar panels, and courtrooms where justice was finally being served. Under each one, the same line kept appearing. If Burkina can do it, so can we. The awakening had begun, and it was not silent. It was roaring. In the gilded meeting rooms of Brussels and Washington, alarm bells were ringing. The headlines from Africa were no longer about coups or crises. They were about revolution, accountability, and rising power. And to some in the West, that was far more threatening. Emergency summits were convened behind closed doors. Think tanks scrambled for narratives. On primetime television, commentators labeled Ibrahim Traoré a radical populist, a threat to global economic stability. French President Emmanuel Macron appeared visibly agitated in a national address, accusing Burkina Faso of endangering international partnerships and vowing economic consequences. Across the Atlantic, President Joe Biden made his own warning clear. U.S. aid to Burkina Faso would be halted immediately unless democratic norms were respected. His tone was firm, his message unmistakable. But Traoré, standing before reporters outside a newly built rural school, responded not with anger, but with cutting clarity. If your aid means silence while we are robbed, then keep it. We've been poor with dignity before, and we'll be rich with it now. Your dollars are worth less than our children's future. The Western world, long accustomed to compliance, was now staring down a continent refusing to kneel. And panic, for once, was not in Africa. It was in the capitals of the Old World, in the hills of western Burkina Faso, where mine shafts once swallowed men whole. The air smells different now, less of dust, more of ironed shirts and morning porridge. The workers still rise early, but now they walk to well-lit, regulated mining zones, wearing proper boots, gloves, and helmets. Safety officers greet them by name. There are water breaks. There is dignity. At a break room overlooking the valley, Hamadou, 46, smiles as he holds up his first pay stub, 10 times higher than what he earned under foreign companies. I can feed my children, send them to school. For the first time, I know what I dig is for us. Nearby, posters on the wall show scholarship programs and technical training offered by the National Mining Academy. One of its top students, Isata, 17, speaks to a visiting journalist with fire in her voice and a notebook full of blueprints. I want to run our mines someday, she says, not for profit. For the people, from men once buried in silence to girls now designing futures, a new legacy is being carved, not in stone, but in story, skill, and sovereignty. And in every corner of the country, a quiet phrase echoes, we rose from dust with our heads held high. The horizon is only a thin, rose-colored line when Ibrahim Traoré slips onto the palace veranda with a leather-bound notebook and an aging fountain pen. The city behind him still sleeps, but the cicadas and distant roosters keep him company. He writes slowly, ink pooling in careful strokes. Victory is loud, justice is quiet. I must remember the quiet. He lists the gains: schools, hospitals, clean water. Then the losses, the friends exiled, the nightly threats, the weight of an entire nation on one spine. A gust of cool Sahel wind lifts the page, and a memory drifts in. 10-year-old Ibrahim standing beside his mother at his father's fresh grave. Red earth, raw grief. He can almost hear his own childish vow, I will protect our people. He closes the book, presses it to his chest, and lets the dawn light wash over the courtyard. Alone, yes, but no longer lonely. In the hush before the city wakes, he realizes that solitude was the price of keeping that promise, and he is willing to pay it again tomorrow. 6 months later, banners ripple above the newly built Burkina National Technical University, a sweeping campus of solar-powered labs and mango-lined walkways. Students in crisp white uniforms march in, flags draped over their shoulders like capes. The grandstand fills with farmers, miners, diplomats, and children who once mined gold but now carry textbooks. Traoré steps to the podium. His voice is steady, amplified across speakers and live streams. This is only the beginning. Africa belongs to Africans, not as a slogan, but as an obligation. From this soil, we will engineer our own future. The crowd roars. Tricolor flags snap in the Harmattan breeze, while a choir of 1,000 voices chants, Traoré, Traoré. But Ibrahim simply lifts a hand and points to the students. Celebrate them, he says, and the chant shifts to étudiants, étudiants. Later, as the anthem plays, he watches the flag rise. Pride flickers in his eyes, but he whispers to an aide, make sure the labs stay open late. Curiosity doesn't keep office hours. News of Burkina Faso's transformation becomes a spark that leaps oceans. In the favelas of Rio, activists screen footage of the tribunal on cracked walls. In Medellin, a miners' cooperative prints pamphlets titled The Burkinabe Blueprint. Filipino fisherfolk cite Traoré while resisting illegal dredging. In rural Bihar, India, teachers discuss community-owned mines during evening classes. One evening in a small Peruvian village, an 8-year-old girl named Camilla watches a subtitled video of Traoré's university speech on her father's phone. Eyes wide, she asks, "Papa, can we do that too?" Her father, a weary cobalt miner, squeezes her hand and murmurs, "We can try." Across continents, hashtags bloom, hashtag gold for the people, hashtag we can try, and petitions call for audits, reparations, and national trust. Some governments bristle, others quietly draft bills. The movement is messy, uneven, unstoppable, because it is no longer about one courtroom, one country, or one man. As new voices rise, the closing frame of a global documentary fades in. A black screen, white letters. This story is not about a hero. It is about what happens when ordinary people decide that justice will no longer wait. And somewhere, in the early light of another dawn, Ibrahim Traoré closes his journal, smiles at the distant echo of new revolutions, and gets back to work. This story is not just about justice. It's about the courage to say enough when silence has gone on too long. Traoré's stand reminds us that true leadership means choosing people over profit, even when standing alone. It's proof that change doesn't begin with power, but with purpose. And once people believe they deserve more, no force can hold them back. What would you stand up for, even if you had to stand alone? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.